So, Julie Delegal has published journalism, editorials, and feature articles in various online print media outlets in Jacksonville and statewide. Through her writing, Julie developed a reputation as an advocate for education and social justice. For over 25 years, Julie also wrote for her family's law firm while raising 3 children with her husband. She earned her bachelor's degree in English, minoring in political science and women's studies at the University of Florida. Her first novel, which you'll be talking about today, Scene, was named a quarterfinalist in the 2019 Screencraft Cinematic Book Competition. This year, Scene was honored with a gold medal for Best Fiction in the Southeast Regional category from the Independent Publisher Book Awards. Julie lives here with her family in Jacksonville. She will be joined in conversation with local creative Kay Huggins, the owner of Aphelion Editing and Consulting, and the host of the Raindrop Corner podcast. As a longtime resident of Jacksonville, Florida, they have sought to support local artistry, foster thought-provoking content, and aid in human rights advocacy. For over a decade, their life has been dazzled with project management, technology industries, logistics, writing, and production. Through the intersectionality of casecraft, they aim to champion the community by providing a platform to marginalized groups. Kay is writing their novel, their debut novel at that, and enjoying leisure moments with their wife and adorable fur babies. Kay, I will leave the rest to you.
Thank you, Imani. I appreciate you. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you to everybody else for being here. And Julie, I adore you as a person, which you already know, and
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm super excited to talk about Scene. So like Imani stated, Scene is based off of a true story, and it features the point of view of 2 characters. We have Jason Royals, who is a teenage Black boy and one that is unlawfully arrested for a crime he didn't commit. And we also have the point of view of a Black homicide detective. We have John Marshall, and he is someone that essentially aids in the forced confession of Jason Royals. So as a Black person, I was very interested in the subject matter and specifically the way the story was written. So I do want to ask you, Julie, what prompted you to write Scene?
Well, when the real life story, the Brenton Butler case, happened here in Jacksonville 22 years ago, I remember being struck by it as a young mother. My oldest child was still in elementary school at the time, and I just couldn't help but think how awful it must be to have your child go missing, not know where he is, and then realize he's been arrested for murder, and that he has, for whatever reason, confessed to murder. And so I was prompted just emotionally as a mother, and the feelings that came up. And then I started to ask, what on earth happened? How could this happen? What went wrong? And these what if questions came into my mind. And I started thinking about how, well, I wonder, maybe they took him back near the scene. Maybe there's a stand of woods over there in that area. Maybe they took him there and things like that. And as these what if questions started popping up in my mind, characters also were there to answer them, my imaginary people, if you will. And so it took a long time to write it, but I felt like I had to get their story down. It was something that just kind of came through.
I like that a lot. A lot of times when we see stories presented in the media, we're looking at them from the lens of the person reporting them. And to be able to ask those what if questions and kind of dive into the source material a little bit deeper and then look at the person. Empathy is such an important thing in the storytelling process. So before we even delve into the creation process of Scene, I have to ask this question. So I'm an editor and an avid reader, and I've had the luxury of seeing Black narratives butchered by people who are not Black. And I have to say, very excitedly that you are not one of those writers. You definitely did this story justice in a way that blew my mind. And that's really why I'm here interviewing you today. I was very impressed with the way you executed writing this novel as a Black person. So I want to expound on that later, but first ask, what made you specifically feel like you should be the one writing this story?
It's a little overwhelming to hear that praise from you. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And having connected with you over this novel, I'm really glad that we were able to connect and that we're here tonight. As for why me, why I thought I should write a story about this. I think in addition to being a mother and having that emotional connection, there was an instant conflict in me because I come from a police family. And when you grow up in a police family, I mean, the first letters I learned were JPD, for Jacksonville Police Department, right? And you are taught that the police are the good guys. And so automatically when this happened, there was just this conflict. How could this happen? I also have a husband who represented, and sometimes still does represent occasionally, police officers. He's an employment attorney. And so I'm sitting here with sort of these insider views, some understanding of police officers, some understanding of the job. And I just felt like, okay, let me get this down. But I did have to ask myself over the years that I was writing this, do I really have a right to write this as a white woman? And the only thing I could come up with was, if I don't write this from where I'm sitting in my position, who's going to write it? And so I followed through.
I have a lot of respect for that. I have a very unique perspective sometimes when it comes to how white people approach Black narratives. And a lot of times I do a lot of work in the advocacy sphere, as you know. And, you know, while it's important for people of color, specifically Black people, to stand up for certain things, it really amplifies the message when people who are not Black, people who are white, create narratives and really kind of dive deep and share thematic elements and just very real and sometimes uncomfortable elements with everyone. It gives it more weight because of the type of world that we live in. I want to revert back to my previous statement where I mentioned that I was blown away about how you were personally able to create this compelling and well planned out narrative. So when you go beyond the way you depicted the shortcomings of our legal and law enforcement oriented systems, we are forced to face and analyze these dynamics, these race dynamics, forced to look at how systematic racism and bias has permeated our societal culture and how we as people respond to it. So with that in mind, and with how Jason Royals, who is the Black boy who is unlawfully detained and then arrested for a crime he didn't commit, and then how you have a Black homicide detective kind of aids in this process, you captured this so well, and specifically how the community deals with it, how the parents and the associated families deal with it. I want to know about your process of respecting this original story went. Tell me about the preparation that went into writing about this particular subject matter.
I want to remind the audience that my story is fictional. It was inspired by the Britton Butler case. And I think there's two answers to this question. First of all, getting the legal stuff right was very important to me. And so there were at least 4 attorneys that I can think of who read the book either in whole or in part. And that said, if you find any mistakes, it's my fault, not theirs. So just getting the nuts and bolts down legally. The other thing was just this deep and sort of abiding acknowledgement as a person who grew up in this community, as a person who grew up in the South, just how deep dyed our culture still is in racism, and coming to understand that we have these default settings that we're not even aware of in our culture. And it's work, and it's not real comfortable to address the ways which these default settings operate. An example is in the news, we have a man, a pastor, going to water his neighbor's lawn who was arrested by police. He's a Black man. And, these things just still happen. A lot of times our dialogue around it centers around law enforcement, but really we're all responsible. And so paying really close attention to what Black writers have to say, and I want to say that I've tried to pay very close attention to our own civil rights royalty here in Jacksonville, namely Rodney Hurst. Rodney Lawrence Hurst Sr. has written extensively on Jacksonville's history on Axe Handle Saturday. His book, It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, about the sit-in in the Woolworths in 1960, is very, it's inspiring and it's powerful, and we need to be teaching it in our schools. So paying very close attention to his writings. He actually, the pastor in my book, Pastor Lawrence, is an homage to Rodney Lawrence Hurst Sr.
I love that. That's amazing that you did that. And what really kind of captivates me about Scene is a lot of times, because of how divisive things can be and the kind of time that we live in, a lot of times when we think about racism in the justice system or in law enforcement, it's oftentimes from the vein of, Black versus white. And the reality of it is it's systematic. It's something that impacts us all. In the book, you have John Marshall, who is the detective. He is a Black detective, and he is someone who is very complicit with the actions that happen in this book. And it explores a nuance that a lot of people actually don't talk about. It's speaking as a Black person, it's something that even Black people kind of shy away from talking about. And that's how we also have to unlearn racism and how it really kind of permeates our culture. And it's such an important topic that I think makes it less of a us versus them kind of situation, and makes it more of a thing that we all need to grow and just become better with navigating. And I think it's wonderful that you were able to do that in a novel. And something that I'm also curious about. So you've kind of touched on it before. You mentioned that as you started researching the case and as you started thinking a little bit more about the case, you were asking all of these what if types of questions. So what made you decide to holistically make this a work of fiction outside of maybe exploring the case on more of a nonfiction based level?
So instead of doing true crime, I chose to write a novel. For one thing, had all these imaginary people living in my head who, all these what if questions sort of generated them. And I really wanted to do justice by them. The other thing is that fiction can take us away from the headlines, take us away from the polarization, from victims and villains and all the sound bites and the simplification of everything. And fiction can get complex. And if the writer is doing his or her job right, then fiction can capture that nuance. And I got two different compliments on the book, and they illustrate in different ways this sort of proposition. And one of the compliments I got, and it's going to sound kind of weird, The person reading the book somehow missed in the early chapters that Detective Marshall is Black. And it comes up again, not real explicitly, but it does come up again. And this person said, you know what? I had to go back and read it again and reevaluate how I felt about Sergeant Marshall. So they were reviewing and deconstructing what was in their mind about this narrative that blinded them to the fact that Marshall is a Black character. And the other compliment I got was from a reader who said, you know, I really tried to hate Sergeant Marshall. I tried. I don't like what he did. I didn't agree with it. But I couldn't hate him. And so that reader, you know, hearing that from a reader really helped me feel like I had accomplished something with that reader anyway.
I think one of the many superpowers of writing, especially there's beauty in all kinds of writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. But you're right, there's a kind of magic to writing fiction, because in that moment, you are able to transport the reader somewhere else. You're able to take concepts that feel stressful or hard, and you're able to make them palatable so that people can get a sense of perspective. And I'm glad that you decided to take it in that direction for that reason. You know, when we're, scrolling through social media or we're reading an article, it's very easy for us to just click away or flip away. But when we're reading a compelling story, we're more likely to absorb the themes that someone is trying to convey. And I think that you did that very well. And like you said, you have a really unique relationship to this case. You know, your father was in law enforcement, as you stated, and then you have the perspective of someone that watched the way that job impacted him. You have the perspective of a community member observing this case. And you also have the experience of observing this case as someone who was very close to a legal practitioner of the real life case. So with that in mind, what themes did you particularly want to explore in this novel?
I think being the daughter of a police officer, he was a homicide detective, by the way. It gave me insight into things that happened. For example, growing up, he told me about a case where there was a mentally disabled man being interviewed by the homicide detectives, and he basically witnessed one of the detectives kind of feeding him the information, and that this mentally disabled man confessed to murder he didn't commit. And that's something that really stuck with me. It still kind of blows me away. I think the detective, or what it came out later when the sheriff's office did an investigation, was that the detective had wanted a book deal about this murder case. And so, getting that sort of inside view of things that really do happen, but also from being married to someone who represented police officers after growing up in a police family, the big thing you realize is that the police are human beings. They're human, they're fallible, they make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are honest, good faith mistakes. Sometimes they really shouldn't have made those mistakes. Sometimes they're like with the confession with the disabled man. Sometimes they're just really inexcusable. But the police are human beings. They're subject to addiction. They have a higher rate of addiction than the rest of us. They have a higher rate of divorce. And certainly my family was not immune to either of those things.
I think it's important to point out too, because it's easy to be angry, and a lot of that anger is valid. But I think remembering that we are all people and that there is grace to be found, while also giving that level of accountability that should definitely be there at the same time. And, what happens to Jason Royals is a fear that a lot of Black people and BIPOC people have. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color, if there's anyone in the audience who didn't know. And the emotions that the detective, John Marshall, wrestles with moving up in his department, which is something that is on his mind, integrating into a system that is historically oppressive, and wrestling with his role in getting a Black boy arrested without just cause. It indirectly explores some of the systems at work and the pressure that even people of color feel within that system. Now, you do a really good job at invoking and illustrating these emotions and thought processes, and it's almost kind of eerie. Like, speaking from personal experience, it's kind of funny. So there's a scene, and I'm not going to spoil the book, I promise. There is a scene in the beginning of the book where Jason the Black boy is talking to his mom, and he's trying to convince her to let him skip church. And the language that you use reminds me very much of me trying to get my mom to let me get out of something that I didn't want to do. And I was very impressed with how you were able to convey language and emotion in this story. So with that in mind, what input did you specifically get from the Black community during your writing process, and how did you illustrate that level of depth in your characters?
I was very lucky to have several trusted friends from the Black community here in Jacksonville who read the book with my, I expressed that my mission was to have them give me honest feedback, and that I would incorporate their feedback, and that I'm listening, because I know this is not a story about me. It's not a story about my culture, and so I really felt like I had to do some homework. One friend gave me some advice on some cultural issues, really one minor thing, but it makes the book more authentic, is that if you're going to go to Thanksgiving and you're Black, you're going to be more likely to have sweet potato pie than pumpkin pie.
This is true.
Right? And so just things like that one friend helped me with. I had another friend who was a young man who had actually been incarcerated, and this young man would absolutely be the first one to take responsibilities for his actions. The consequences, however, might have been very different had he been my son, had he not been Black. So race actually played a part in the consequences that he endured. And one of the things that was very meaningful to me that he shared was just the sense of anger, of being just kind of trapped and chewed up by a system that has so much momentum. I mean, the state is a big monster. It has a lot of momentum. It can chew you up. And that anger, I let that anger echo in some of the things that Jason, the main character, experienced. And then another person, a mother who is a Black woman and has a biracial child. And I think most biracial people are recognized as Black in our community. And one of the things that was just so edifying to me was that she was able to express, so police officers are trained not to allow their confirmation bias to use evidence to prove what they believe is true. So confirmation bias is you have a belief and you look for evidence to prove that belief, and then you tend to discount other evidence even though it may counter your belief, you just tend to push that aside. And so what this mother said to me was, okay, that phrase, whatever you say is maybe held against you. It's because police officers are listening to put together their own narrative of what happened, and what you say absolutely will be held against you. And so if you're arrested, particularly if you're a minority who's arrested, and I say this as, the child, and by the way, my dad was a big believer in due process of law and was commended by prosecutors for making their job easier by following the rules. But yeah, it's just better not to speak. It's better not to speak, to wait for your parents or your attorney and just don't speak.
Yeah, it's a really rough situation to be in. I've never been in a situation like Jason Royals, but I have had an illegal search done on me when I had been doing nothing wrong, wasn't in a place of question that would have prompted that. And, that fear and then that consequent anger that comes with it when you think about what if creates this vat of anger that just magnifies and feeds the system. And all of those feelings are valid, but it makes it really hard to connect as individuals. Now, I realize that this is also really heavy material. Like when I created these questions, I really wanted to ask you questions that maybe people had, but wouldn't ask out loud, and maybe some that they would. And with that in mind, I know that your book also touches on so many things. It's about the shortcomings of our justice system, the systematic racism and biases in police procedures. It's about fear, anger, which we just talked about, love, community, and change, and the need for change, and how do we change? And I think books like Seen, it's a great analysis of how that change can occur. And a lot of change, all change starts with this. It starts through thoughts and seeds that are planted. So with that in mind, what personal impact has writing this book had on you? What has it changed about you?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the timing of when I finished, and what's been happening in our community, in our country for the past 6 years or so. I finished the book in 2018. I spent some time editing it, and then by 2020 was looking for publishers, doing queries and whatnot. And George Floyd happened. And so getting this book out, and what has changed in me is very much a sense of urgency. I have very much a sense of urgency around committing and being an ally in the struggle, as Ronnie Hurst would call it. It's always great to talk to him. But the civil rights movement, it's constant gardening. I think a lot of us would like to think that the civil rights movement is something that happened in the United States in the 1960s, and it's over and done with. Been there, done that. And I think that because white people are so uncomfortable talking about race or thinking about privilege, we and many of our leaders just don't want to talk about it, don't want us to talk about it. And so it's constant gardening. If we're not vigilant, if we're not standing up for what's right, then we're enabling white supremacy, because again, it's our default setting.
It is. And I feel like from media and just the system at place, it's kind of designed to maintain that. And in a lot of ways, though, I have hope in people. I have seen people, no pun intended. I have seen people grow and make the decision to make better decisions and to look a little bit deeper than what their assumptions tell them. for a lot of moments when I was reading your book, I was in deep emotion because it was an experience for me. I'm observing this Black boy go through this situation, but I'm also seeing these officers humanized, and I get to see, what things are on their mind, what they're concerned about, like little quips and jokes that they make with each other. We don't get to see that when we're watching a news report, or when we're just kind of looking at something on social media or in a movie depicting a very particular type of point of view. And I really like the way you were able to use that nuance to tell a visceral story. It became an experience. So I'm going to deviate away from heaviness, since you've talked at length about a lot of different elements of creating this book and what went into the characters. So what were some of your favorite scenes to write without spoiling the book?
There were so many. I really enjoyed writing the courtroom scenes. That was just a lot of fun for me. And just, when you work at a law firm, you're constantly reading depositions and trial transcripts and things like that. And so I was eager to kind of get that going and see what Aaron Hampton, who's our civil rights attorney and criminal defense attorney in the book, see what he could pull off, and in a way that would not disappoint me. Okay, because I think I've been privy to seeing some good lawyering over the years. So, but there are two other really favorite parts of the book of mine, and it might spoil. So I'll say the ending was a very favorite part of mine to write, and the right after the criminal justice proceedings, right after the hearing. And in my book, the case, well, I don't want to say it, I won't spoil it, but anyway, right after some of the proceedings ended. That was a really delightful, fun part to write.
There were a lot of really cool parts of the book. I really loved the legal proceedings. And as I was reading it, I'm like, wow, she really knows her stuff. I love like crime and thriller based fiction. And I've read a lot of it. And I'm like, I was just really impressed with the way you wrote those scenes. And like, this is a sidebar. And I know we're getting close to like the time where we invite the audience to ask questions. So I'll keep this part brief. But I also really liked how you explored the importance of like mental health, and specifically, in the aftermath of what Jason Royals has to go through, just him being able to seek that, and the importance of what's psychologically going on when you're in those situations. A lot of times there's a lot of stigma associated with mental health. So sometimes you don't really get to see the importance of that expressed. So thank you for also showing scenes on that and kind of like adding very detailed context to it.
Yeah, that was really important to me. The scenes with Dr. Greenspan, his psychologist, and Jason being able to finally get to the point. And I really do have to thank my friend again, who was incarcerated and traumatized by his experience and the things that he shared with me. Another aspect I really enjoyed writing was Jason's spiritual journey. And I don't think it ended with the book. And it's just, it was nice to kind of go back in time and try to remember the way I thought and felt as a teenager, and my children and some of their questions and the way they commented on things about spiritual life. So
I really liked that too, because I mean, everyone's different, but how you look at spirituality when you're younger compared to when you have these very impacting experience changes and shifts and alters. And it was really cool to see how that happened for him. So I'm going to open things up to the audience. Amani and Allison mentioned earlier that there are some cards, some notepads under your chairs. So if you have any questions for Julie that you would like to ask, feel free to go ahead and write those down and get those to us, and we'll gladly get those answered for you. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question. So the first question is, what writers are your favorite in the mystery/crime genre? How did they influence your writing? Oh, that's a good question.
Wow. In the crime genre, and I don't read a lot of crime fiction. But one writer I admire who has written stories that include things about the criminal justice system is Chris Bojalian, and just he's just a master. His characterization, the way he unwinds things, you get a sense, but you don't really know until you're through the book. So he is definitely one of my favorites and one of my favorite examples.
Good choice. So the next question is, what is your writing process from idea to finished product? It's another good question.
So I get an idea and I get all these what if questions, and people start popping up in my head. And I think if all the people that came to life over this novel, if I had kept them all, it would be 3 times the length that it is. And so part of the process is, just kind of going freeform with these characters and what's happening with them, and trying to put yourself in the scenes with other characters and reveal things about the characters. And then ask yourself, okay, of all of these stories coming out, which one are you going to pick? And you have to pick, that's the hardest part for me, is narrowing down and getting to a clear, distinct, singular narrative. So
I can relate to that as a writer. It's really hard. I know that everybody's a little bit different when they write. Mine just kind of spill out of my head and I have a very clear outline. And then the next day I wake up and I'm like, oh, well, now this character wants to change their complete backstory. That's fine. And it creates like this very fun playground where you have to kind of figure out what you're going to pick. So thank you for sharing that. As you were writing scene, did you heavily outline the story, or did you kind of write as the thoughts came to you?
I wrote it in I did have an outline, and it changed. And backstories do change. Sometimes you need somebody to be born a few years earlier, or a few years later, or whatever the case may be. So I had an outline, I had a definite structure in mind, but until I sat with the main characters and got down what I needed from them, I don't think it was final in any way. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. It was in flux. It was a very adaptable outline.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I feel like Bonnie's coming with more questions. There we go. There's several. Okay. So the next question, compare your book to The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, about the young Black boy falsely arrested and sent to the Mariana Bay Home, boys' home. Apologies for that.
I have Colson Whitehead's Harlem Shuffle on my nightstand as part of reading that I want to do. I have a lot of books that I want to read that are sitting on my nightstand. And I have not read The Nickel Boys. And so that is going to be one that I pick up. It seems very critical to the genre. So thank you to whoever wrote that question. And thank you for everybody showing up. It's really nice to be talking to a full room of people and to people online.
Definitely. I'm going to add that to my queue as well. The next question is, what are some of your favorite classic books? Also, how was your day? I love that.
How was my day? It's gotten better. I was fighting off a headache, and I think it would have been worse had it actually rained. So that was nice that the rain held off. Some of the classics, I think my idea of classics has changed over the years. One of the best books that's destined to be a classic is All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. I think that everything ever written by Toni Morrison, I have not read every one of her books, but I've read quite a few, are critical to the American canon. And by the way, when I was writing, and part of what you learn as a writer is don't keep going back and revising as you go along, or you can do that, but it'll be really slow. So keep going, keep getting a draft out. And I think it was when I gave myself permission to not be Toni Morrison, because who can be Toni Morrison, right? When I gave myself permission to maybe shoot for John Grisham, then that helped me. I hope that answers the question.
It's a good person to shoot for. The next question is, the fictional town and scene is not Jacksonville. What was the model for the town where the story is set? Is it a real town?
So Beau Rev, which all the locals pronounce Beau Reeve, is completely fictional. It's not a real town. I don't know if you've ever had the sense of going to a smaller town or city and you feel like you've gone back in time, maybe 20 or 30 years. Has anybody had that feeling? So that's what I was going for. Something a little smaller than Jacksonville to just give us a sense of going back in time. It would be probably about where Palatka is.
Gosh.
And it would probably be about the size of Tallahassee. So a small city, not teeny weeny, but smaller, much smaller than Jacksonville. And I tried to bring in things from Jacksonville, like instead of Big Jim, the whistle, we had Big Jack. And definitely the river, because it's just, flows through the heart of all of us. So it is Jacksonville in a metaphorical sense.
It had like a really nice timelessness to it. And it felt more intimate than Jacksonville. We have so many different sections to Jacksonville that sometimes it can feel overwhelmingly large, but small at the same time, which is very odd. But yes, you could definitely feel that from the city. So the next question that I have is, what would be an important quirk that you would use to bring out a detective's true character? That's a really good question.
I think and I don't know if you call this a quirk, but one of the things about Detective John Marshall was he was not entirely sure anymore he wanted to keep doing this job. And so that aspect of his personality, whether it's really a quirk or not, I don't know. I think when he transfers into a different department, he gets out of homicide, spoiler, and he ends up with he has a lightness. There's a lightness. It's a different feel when he moves into fugitives and warrants, and just their sense of humor. I think that the thing about police officers is they see so much, they deal with so much that many of them absolutely develop a sense of humor to get them through the day.
I've known a lot of police officers. Growing up, we had a lot of police officers who were just family friends. So the comedy is definitely something that I do recognize. And just from my time in Jacksonville, I've done a lot of work with different officers and things of that nature. So I've had a lot of them come to me. I've worked with like liaisons periodically that work with JSO, and a lot of them have kind of expressed sometimes the heaviness that comes along with the job. And I like that you talked about that because, and it's not excusing what sometimes happens, but there has to be an incredible heaviness with doing a job where you are kind of forced to police different areas. You were forced to do these really hard things that sometimes it can be very thankless. And I really like the fact that you were able to kind of bring that into the characters. Does anybody have any other questions for Julie at all?
So the question is, what role does class play in the story? If Jason, my character, had been of a different social class, would the story have been different? I think there's if you'll bear with me a minute. First of all, Jason was kind of solidly in the middle class. His mother was a nurse. His father was a teacher. They were not rich. They talked about the Black Boule and how Jason and his family could avail themselves of people in their community to help get him the legal help that he needed. What is the role of class in these types of situations? So I've described Jason's class status, if you will. We don't, as Americans, like to think that we have class distinctions, but we do. And I think one of the, I think that when you think of class in terms of poverty and you understand how race and poverty overlap in complex ways, so even if it's not a straight up economic class thing, we still have, we don't like to think of it, but in our sort of default settings, racism can also be construed as a class distinction. I think that might have been one of the problems with the detective. The detective, because he was trying to succeed in the sheriff's office, because of pressures he was feeling himself, he, as you put it, I think when we were talking about this before, he adopted the mindset of the colonizer. And there's a great book that I've heard about on NPR, and the title of it is The Colony and the Kingdom. And so when police officers police certain areas of town, they're in the kingdom, and they're in the suburbs, and they might approach people differently based on that fact. When police officers are policing more urban areas, they're in the colony, and it's like a colonized area, and the demeanor that they adopt may change when they shift from kingdom to colony. And even, it doesn't hold 100% because we had, again, the pastor in Alabama living in the suburbs, watering his neighbor's yard. And so I guess the long and the short of it is that class and race are all tied up in our country. They get conflated a lot. They overlap. As with everything in this book, it's hard to generalize and make blanket statements. And I think it's valuable to try to get to the actual level of human interaction. Does that help? Yeah. I don't disagree. And I think that only recently, and I don't want to get controversial or political, but we're looking at student loans, for example, and with student loan forgiveness, and particularly with forgiveness for student loans where students had Pell Grants, that's going to be a very restorative for a lot of Black people who went to college. And so, again, I've probably said too much.
No, I agree. I have to say, like, on a personal level, I really enjoyed your question. You're right. People don't talk about class as much, and it's a nuance that people forget. It's not racism from the vein of what we think of as traditional racism only. There are class elements, and there are other elements combined with that as well. So thank you for asking that question. The next question that I have is, when you express a sense of urgency regarding the Black-white divide, what is your advice to us on how to advocate and lessen the issue in Jacksonville? It's a really good question, whoever asked that.
I think if you can get a hold of anything that Rodney Hurst has written, that's a good start if you're a reader, and you wouldn't be here if you weren't readers. And then he co-authored something with Professor Jameson from UNF recently. Trying to think of the name of it. He's written so many books.
He has written a lot of books, and I'm trying to search my mind too.
Right. It wasn't about a hot dog and a Coke was one. If we don't tell our story, no, it won't get told is another. And then the other one with Dr. Jameson is interesting because it goes, you have a cross-generational perspective because Rodney's much older and Dr. Jameson is much younger. So reading, I think, would be a start. I think really listening to people who are active in the civil rights movement and listening to what they're saying. I think as white people, particularly my generation, and the kind of the whitewashing that occurred after Dr. Martin Luther King, we're almost conditioned to expect Black people to be really superhuman in a lot of ways. And so when Black people start telling the truth, we start getting uncomfortable and we stop listening. And so really trying to set aside our own biases and just listen.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. If I can add something to that, if you're comfortable with that. Also, get out in the community, specifically in areas that you wouldn't normally go to. Like a good example is like town hall or city hall meetings, or if there are what we call calls to action, involve yourselves in those. A lot of, speaking from my perspective, I'm 31 for context. I've been in Jacksonville for about 8 years, born and raised in Florida, but lived up in North here and there. And I don't personally feel like I really integrated myself into politics and into community specifically as much as I have here. And all of that really started with going to town hall meetings, meeting leaders and figureheads in the city. I've even met with politicians that I don't agree with because I am hungry for knowledge and hungry for perspective. And with that being said, I highly encourage you to do that. know who's running for office, talk to them. Like, even if you don't particularly agree with them, find out who lives in your community. It's such a small thing when you say it, but it does help the divide, because how you treat others starts with how do you treat them at home, I think. And that's just something that I always tell people to be very mindful of. Be more comfortable with being uncomfortable.